For today's presentation, we will be discussing the Greek philosopher Socrates and how he has so impacted both philosophy and the world itself. Before I can talk about who he was, I find it important to discuss where he came from. Socrates was born in the Greek polis of Athens. To the right, I wanted to show a map of the Greek peninsula to give you an idea of the land he lived on in his lifetime. Athens, in particular, is located on the water. As we have seen, this allowed for much trade, economic growth, and naval power. Socrates lived mostly during the Golden Age of Athens, which spanned from 479 to 404 BCE. The biggest noticeable difference between Athens and other polis at this time was their government. Athens had democracy. This democracy was created by Pericles, a strategoi which had great influence after the Persian Wars in creating this age. A democracy is a form of government where the people ruled. At this time, people only meant 20% of the population, though, as the only people who could participate in government were citizens that were men. During this period, there was also a large rise in art, entertainment, and education. In this photo, I wanted to show how absolutely amazing Athens became and the idealistic beauty their art held, whether in sculpture or architecture. Ideals of this time lied in beauty and power, but they were not found in wisdom or self-thought, but through external things. As we saw in the last slide, the sculpture to represent gods and men looked the same. This shows how the people wanted to portray themselves in perfection. They were also well known for seeking power. The rich of Athens did this through greed and brutality. This golden age was brought about through those corrupted ideals when Pericles and other officials stole all of the treasure off of Delos from the Delian League. This age was born from the need for greed and perfection, and that may be a cause for their fall later on. Sophism was the main philosophy before Socrates. The main idea of this was to think whatever is good for you is right. The main people involved in this way of teaching were men like Alcibiades and other men with status or power in Athens. These men found success through doing whatever was needed to get the job done. At this time, these men were known to be wise, but when you look up the definition of sophism now, the Oxford English Dictionary states, a specious but fallacious argument, either used deliberately in order to deceive or mislead. Now that we have looked toward the area and time Socrates grew up in, we can start talking about the man of mystery himself. I call him this because the Socratic problem was named after this man and the difficulty to piece together Socrates or any other person of history without material written actually by that person. We get most of our information on this man through his most famous students, Plato and Xenophon. Socrates was born in 470 BCE. His parents were Phanerete, his mother, and Sophronicus, his father. His father was a stonesman and sculptor, while his mother was a midwife. As you will see in the next slide, he did do jobs similar to his father when he was younger, but he stated when he got older that he took more after his mother since he was giving birth to knowledge. I find it also important to point out that Socrates was an educated man. As a free boy in the Golden Age, he would have gone to school and studied music, gymnastics, and grammar. Socrates had many other jobs besides the path he took toward philosophy. One of his first jobs that he became very good at was the same as his father, a sculptor. Some people say that he made the very famous sculpture now known as the Three Graces. He would try to make statues represent completely wise and good people, but he couldn't. There was always something missing. When he asked other stonesmen what goodness meant so he could better portray it in his sculptures, they could not give him an answer. So he put down his carving tools from that day on and chose to find beauty in philosophy instead. Another career he had was that of a soldier. The battle he was known most for his courage and bravery was the Battle of Potidæa. This battle happened in 432 and was one of the first battles of the Peloponnesian War. This battle was fought because the Corinths would not ally with Athens when asked to. Socrates fought in this battle, and the Athenians tried to give him a medal in his honor, but he chose to give it to Alcibiades because he did not need that kind of honor. He also saved Alcibiades' life in battle. Socrates was also a family man. He had a wife, Xanthippe, and 3 sons. All that I could find about his sons was that Xenophon, one of Socrates' students, thought these boys were dull and nothing like Socrates. His wife is mentioned more, though, and was known to be somewhat crude. She is talked about in Plato's recount of Socrates' trials and death as crying and being made to leave, but leaving behind the emotions with the men watching their teacher and their friend die. He might have had a brilliant and beautiful mind, but Socrates was definitely not known for that same brilliance or beauty when it came to his outer looks. Plato compared Socrates to a satyr, a half-man, half-goat, because of his large belly and pudgy nose. Socrates shows his humor through his looks, though, as well. Xenophon wrote about a time when his teacher bet a man, well known for being handsome, to a sort of beauty contest. All of the children were to vote anonymously who the most handsome was, and be able to give that one a hug after as the reward. No one voted for Socrates. He was also known as a humble man. We saw an example of this personality trait in the last slide when he gave the medal back to Alcibiades. What he wore also showed his humble side. He did not dress as a decorated hero or an elite of Athens would, but instead did not wear shoes and would not bathe for long periods of time. This also showed his distaste for Athenian hierarchy. That leads us into another main personality trait of this historic man: rebelliousness. To us, his actions would not make a rebel, but in his time, the way he dressed, disregarded hierarchy, and spoke to all women, slaves, and elites alike was as rebellious as you could get. I find a very interesting place to see this trait is in his trials, which we will discuss later on in this presentation. One of the best places we can see a true, or what we think is true, representation of Socrates is in Plato's Apology. This is a recount of the trials of Socrates, and we can hear through Socrates' own words about his visit to the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was a famous woman of her time. She lived in the temple of Apollo and was known for her divine prophecies she would give people when they would come seek her out with questions. Her prophecies were known for being vague and often misinterpreted, but the one she gave to Socrates seemed fairly clear. She told him that there was no man wiser than he. Most people would have gone back to Athens and started screaming from the middle of the agora, yelling what an amazing person they were. Instead, Socrates chose to try to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone else wiser than he. That became Socrates' mission. The longer he carried out this mission, though, the more he started to realize the oracle was correct. He claimed that there was no wiser than him because he was the only man that knew that he knows nothing. The oracle's prophecies have been called under speculation or have been seen as hallucinations since the oracle was breathing in toxic ethylene all day from fissures under where she sat. Even so, I don't think many of us can say that she was wrong in saying that at this time of Athens, there was no one wiser than Socrates. Socrates is known as the father of Western philosophy. This is not to be mistaken with the father of modern philosophy, which is Descartes. Socrates was named this because he was so innovative in his way of thinking and approach to philosophy as a whole. The main difference I found between Socrates and other men of his time was the way he taught people. Instead of telling people that they had to believe one certain idea, he taught people to think for themselves and find their own wisdom as he so tried to do in his own life. He helped teach people that the first step of wisdom was to find out all the things you do not know, and then search and discuss the possibilities of what they could be. Father is a perfect term for Socrates, since he was really like the head of a new household of many different forms of philosophy. His students formed many different schools, which shows once again how Socrates was like his midwife mother, giving birth to new ideas. As we will see later on, the different portions of Socrates lived on through his students and continue to be used in many different ways today. One of the most surprising and yet satisfactory things that I have discovered about Socrates is his appreciation and non-judgmental attitude toward women. In Plato's rendition of Socrates, you can find quite a few passages where he talks about women's role in society. One passage I like the most is in the Timaeus by Plato. In this passage, Socrates is giving an entertainment, which means to entertain guests instead of barraging people with question and answer per usual. The book states, "The characters of the women are to be modeled in a similar way to the men's, and the women share the same occupation both in war and in the rest of life." This is a far reach from the role of women currently in Athens at this point. Currently at this time, a respectable woman was someone who stayed in the house to lead the slaves, make clothes, and take care of the children. Some plebeian families had the woman work, but that was not normal at all in the families of the elite. This shows how innovative and out-of-the-box Socrates' way of thinking was for this time period. Also, the fact that his wife was there with his friends when he was in a prison cell and a part of the conversation at all was not common and shows that he even chose to marry a woman who wasn't afraid to speak. Many people think that this influence on Plato is the reason that he allowed women into his school after the death of Socrates. This school was the last one for a long time to do so after. It is a bit difficult to figure out exactly what Socrates believed. Since Plato wrote most of the information we have found on the philosophical principles of Socrates, it is hard to tell where Socrates' ideas start and Plato's end. Some people also believe that Plato might have made certain ideas of Socrates a little bit different to help further his own credibility with the people who followed him. Either way, it was quite obvious that Socrates tended to like to question others' beliefs than to talk about his own. One thing we do know for sure is that most of Socrates' teachings were about morality and ethics instead of the natural philosophy or science that was also being studied around this time. One of my favorite shows of this philosophical study from Socrates is something I found in a book called Socrates by George Rudabush. This snippet is a conversation Socrates was having with a man named Critias, where he was asking if knowledge is all you need for happiness. Socrates states in this text, "Knowledgeable living does not make us do well and be happy, not even living according to all other branches of knowledge together, but only according to the single knowledge of good and bad. For Critias, if you choose to take away this knowledge from all the others, will medicine any the less give us health? Or shoemaking give us shoes? Or weaving give us clothes? Or will the pilot's expertise any the less prevent us dying at sea? Or the generals in war?" This shows Socrates' questions were often based on how to find your own happiness through ethical themes like good and bad, instead of general knowledge. Another viewpoint Socrates took about knowledge and wisdom had to do with desire or eros in the ancient Greek world. Socrates used eros to describe the need for wisdom that he believed was required to do philosophy. Eros is almost a need or impulsive desire for something. It often related to love in ancient times. What Socrates meant in his comparison between wisdom and eros is that you need to have the kind of love for wisdom as you would for someone you cared for deeply. We all do dumb things for love, and I think that is something most people can relate to. That is the kind of love Socrates had for wisdom, and was a kind of love he stated everyone should have for it. If you don't understand how deep his desire was, then I want you to think about the way he died. He could have lived if he gave up that wisdom or the pursuit of it, but he would rather die than give that up. Have you ever thought to yourself that you would take a bullet for someone you really loved, like your family, your child, wife, husband, maybe a very good friend? That's what Socrates did, but for wisdom. Plato and Xenophon have many differences in their writings about who Socrates was and of his life. But one thing they definitely agreed upon was the fact that he claimed to have a voice that told him when he was doing things that were wrong. What was this voice? Where did it come from? These are questions that are continuously being asked and are a mystery like much of Socrates' life. Socrates doesn't speak much of the gods of Athens or religion, but it is still important to focus on these spots where he does, to get an even better understanding of who he was as a philosopher, a man, and to maybe answer the questions I asked. We know he somewhat believed in the gods of his times because he has spoken on occasions throughout all of his texts about him that he needs to follow the Oracle of Delphi's prophecy. This woman gets her prophecies from Apollo, so he must have believed in some of the gods. He also mentions spilling wine to Zeus in the Symposium by Plato. This shows that he did believe in the gods, but were the gods the ones speaking to him in his head? I personally don't believe so. There is much speculation around what the voice could be, but many, including myself, believe it is the voice of reason we all have. I have deduced this because Socrates also made claims that we all have a bit of divine inspiration in all of us. This tells me that the voice in his head that told him when something was wrong was the conscience I have felt when I'm doing something I shouldn't. This idea is so debated because Plato and Xenophon talked about his voice, but never claimed hearing one themselves. Xenophon actually speaks badly about the divine inspiration given to Socrates by the voice. Socrates claimed that he knew he was doing the right thing when he did not go against the sentence of death in his trials, because the voice was not once heard in the trial, so it meant Socrates was doing the right thing. At this point in the presentation, I am going to take a step away from talking about the man himself and instead talk about the event that took place, which was a large portion in not only the fate of Socrates, but of Athens itself. This event is the Peloponnesian War. This war spanned from 431 BCE to 405 BCE. As we have already talked about, Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War as an Athenian hoplite. That is not the part of the war I plan to talk about, though. This war brought the end of the Golden Age of Athens. The Peloponnesian War was fought between Sparta and their allies against the Athenians and their allies. The Spartans thought the Athenians were getting too big for their britches and decided they needed to be brought down a peg. Since the Athenians and Spartans have very different strengths, they were at a stalemate for quite a while. The Athenians were a great naval power, while the Spartans were very good at fighting over land. This war brought out the worst in Athenians. They asked Milos to come ally with them in the fight against the Peloponnesian League, which is Sparta and their allies. But Milos refused, because they wanted to stay neutral in the chaos. Out of anger, the Athenians slaughtered every man on the island and enslaved every woman and child of Milos. Thucydides, a historian of Athens, said it best when he claimed, "War had reduced men's characters to a level with their own fortunes." Athens was finally defeated because the same need for power I discussed in the previous slide on ideals came to ruin them. Alcibiades decided to take armies to Sicily to bring himself more glory and power and to maybe spread the reaches of the Athenian Empire. This ended in complete failure, with the Athenians losing many men and ships and not having enough to fight back against the Peloponnesian League anymore. The Athenians were forced to scale back their power and never fully recovered again. The end of this golden age brought much darkness to the city and seems to be highly involved with the anger taken out on Socrates in the next slide to come. As we saw in the last slide, tensions were very high during the Peloponnesian War. These tensions grew even higher after the defeat of Athens. The Athenians started to turn in toward their own people, and Socrates was one of their main targets. You see, he had gotten many enemies through his life because he would embarrass many of the elites. No one likes to be embarrassed or to be proven that they don't know something. The fact that he did that to people for pretty much his whole adult life can equal a lot of enemies, since he was about 70 at his trial. His enemies took the chance during the uproar of the downfall of Athens and had Socrates charged with impiety and corruption of the youth. Impiety means to have a lack of respect or reverence for the gods. Both of these charges were technically accurate, since he believed things that were not pious in the form of Athenian beliefs, and since he taught those ways to the youths of Athens. Socrates was put on trial for these charges. He was put in front of a jury of 500 Athenian male citizens all over the age of 30. Socrates refused the help of his friends in giving him a speechwriter or lawyer of sorts and decided to take the stand himself. For his defense, though, Socrates pretty much told the jury that they were all ignorant and that he had done nothing wrong at all, because he was actually helping the people of Athens learn things that they could never understand. Even though this was probably true, it obviously was not the best tactic for defending oneself. Even so, the jury did vote very closely on his guilty or non-guilty verdict. 280 men voted guilty, while 220 men voted not guilty. For the second portion of the trial, the jury needed to vote between two punishments. The first punishment offered was death, and the second punishment offered was a large fine that the powerful friends of Socrates offered to pay. At this point, most people would start to grovel, ask for forgiveness, and say they would never do such a thing again. Socrates was not like most people, though. He instead told the jurors that he should be rewarded for his services and not punished at all. He stated that he should be given free meals in the Prytaneum, which was a public dining hall in the middle of Athens, and maybe a statue built of him. This so offended the jurors that even the people that voted him not guilty mostly voted for him to be put to death instead of having to pay a fine. Socrates was not worried about this verdict, though, because as one of his most famous sayings go, life without inquiry is not worth living. Some of the most impactful of Plato's writing on Socrates was that of them sitting in the cell together where Socrates was being put to death. You might be wondering how they were in his cell with him, as that would never happen in this day and age. The cells were set up differently then. His cell was on the outskirts of Athens, and he could have easily escaped and just left. Many of his friends begged and pleaded for Socrates to just leave with them, for you see they had large properties right outside of Athens, and the verdict would not stand there. They kept telling Socrates of this escape plan, but Socrates just turned towards his pupils and friends and stated that he was not going to leave and did not fear dying. The amazing thing we see about Socrates was the fact that he never changed his ideals around, even up to the point of his death. Socrates was officially put to death by hemlock, a poison herb, in 399 BCE. He died at the age of 71 years old, but his ideas did not die with him. His legacy lives on in his pupils and in philosophy even now.